Welcome to the Numerical Tarot, a new tarot paradigm, an alternative to tradition, an axial system of archetypal crystallography, a trans-culturally anthropomorphized life-biased binary influence calculator, a wisdom system and archetype enhancer with harmony of interpretation throughout. The content of all the videos in this series are excerpts, edits and brief summaries from the eBooks All Things Are Numbers and All Things Are Patterns, links below. For a more complete explanation of each idea, additional reading might be helpful. Hopefully the basic ideas come across enough to pique your interest in trying this alternative approach to tarot. Through previous videos in this series, we've established a very simple model of existence. We labeled it with a number line. We divided that number line into a fixed array of binary opposites. The numerical tarot is definitely different from more traditional forms of tarot in many ways. In continuing, we will note one of the most important differences to be found within the numerical tarot is its devotion to consistency in design. In the numerical tarot, this consistency of design is organically achieved with the use of those clearly defined opposites, working together, to produce another very important difference of this deck: contrast. Lack of contrast and lack of consistency are two very important things that are, for the most part, missing from traditional tarot decks and, as a result, often confuse and frustrate people who are just beginning their journey into the realm of traditional tarot. Obviously, traditional tarot is not without its theoretical philosophies of underlying structure, with Kabbalah, astrology and alchemy being major contributors. What the study of tarot being presented here objects to is the end result that any of those philosophies creates. To the numerical tarot, the idea of cards that seem subjectively good and bad being mixed together in a single row of the deck, some getting better when reversed and some getting worse, and none of them relating to each other in any coherent way as a progression of ideas along a line, is a less than satisfactory design. A design consisting of 40 individual ideas without much continuity is an option that many have lived with for years. And while some authors will attempt to discuss all the cards of any one number as a group, or any one suit as a group, no one ever discusses cards of the minor suits together as a set of ideas that span a spectrum of possibilities. The numerical tarot does. The diagram shown here reveals a completely new way of looking at the tarot. Perhaps even the world. By employing things like balance, symmetry, contrast and consistency, the numerical tarot creates a structured environment that is easy to navigate, and even more importantly, easy to learn. By utilizing balance, symmetry, contrast and consistency, the design of the numerical tarot leads to a deck where no card stands alone. In this way, the numerical tarot stands as a true alternative to tradition. As an alternative, this system is in fact a plain, simple and straightforward design that uses a common-sense approach to sort through everyday forms of life experience. In this schema, cards that are vertically opposite to each other on the matrix of overlapping yins and yangs just created, are seen as partners in describing a spectrum of possibilities. In the numerical tarot, I chose to illustrate the subjectively good of the positive and the bad of the negative. Thus, unlike traditional tarot, where we never know if a reversed meaning of a card improves or worsens things, in the numerical tarot we do. In the numerical tarot, the good positive cards are all considered to be exaggerated to a bad extreme when reversed, and the bad negative cards are all considered to be mitigated to a good condition when reversed. By being so predictable, we keep things simple. By keeping things simple, we make learning easier. Most importantly, by creating such a design, we see how cards in the deck work together. They are not 40 individual ideas born out of an amalgam of disparate wisdom systems smushed together to produce random results. In the numerical tarot, each set of cards describes a full and complete spectrum of thought for any core concept of archetypal influence. The numerical tarot organizes ideas across more than one card, to create a complete spectrum of ideas. We could try to do this with a traditional deck, like Rider-Waite-Smith, but because decks like that are so inconsistent in their design organization and distribution of positive and negative or so-called good and bad-looking cards, the results would be incomplete and thereby not satisfactory. However, with the numerical tarot, this system of organization works very well. I don't know of any other deck in the world that does this. In the numerical tarot deck, no card stands alone. Each card is part of a spectrum of possibilities. Don't ever examine a card with such a limited focus as to completely ignore its relatives on this spectrum. It's one of the many important ways to observe and utilize the balance, symmetry, contrast, and consistency of the numerical tarot. By sidestepping the pitfalls of syncretism, the numerical tarot is able to invent a completely new system for the sorting of human thought. Along with the acknowledgement of relativity in all matters concerning the ultimate good or bad that one might take away from any given situation, the numerical tarot attempts to convey this relativity of meaning by placing any and all concepts of thought onto spectrums of possibilities that run from one extreme to another. The diagram shown here is an attempt to illustrate the idea of tarot cards working together as a set, to describe just such a spectrum of possibilities. To organize that thought, each core concept is mapped upon a spectrum that attempts to unite, with language, the extremes and in-betweens of possibilities. There are a lot of people out there who are confused about the meaning of each card of tarot. And while they may do all right at interpreting visually from the actual illustrations provided by each deck, they remain confused about the meaning of cards that are reversed and have no illustrations. In fact, entire books have been published for the expressed purpose of suggesting to people what the reverse of each tarot card might mean. Lots of people are afraid to even consider reversed meanings and don't use them, unless they happen to purchase one of these books devoted to telling them what they are. The numerical tarot is different. The numerical tarot is actually devoted to providing a simple, common-sense device that will reveal, with balance, symmetry, contrast, and consistency what each card means in both upright and reversed orientation. In other words, with a system like this, you don't need to be told what the reverse meaning of a card is. All you need to know is the core archetypal concept, and with predictable variations along a spectrum of possibilities, work out the other upright and reversed meanings on your own, using your own vocabulary. You don't memorize meanings, you invent them, based on common sense reasoning along a spectrum of possibilities that is predictable in design. That is a very unique approach to tarot that you will not find anywhere else. Of course, those who interpret tarot intuitively, or visually, without any acknowledgement of underlying structure at all, don't mind being left to their own devices on matters of card meaning. People who interpret intuitively, or visually, hardly even need a book of any kind at all. They usually decide on their own what each card means, based on intuition about each given situation at the time of a reading. In short, they relish the inherent malleability that such lack of precision provides, and utilize it effectively. This works well for those using tarot. It doesn't always work as well for those studying tarot. Personally, when studying tarot, or when attempting to explain what it is that lead to the creation of each unique image of a deck, I prefer a system that arranges disparate opposing concepts into a sensible array of related ideas. People's use of language is subjective. Vocabulary is subjective. In this study of tarot, it is proposed that matrix organization of vocabulary can help with more precise speech when interpreting tarot, or really, life in general. By anchoring our thoughts and words to a matrix of subdividing opposites, we reduce ambiguity in our communication of ideas from one brain to another. Of course, many may think that such precision is like a mental straitjacket to the intuitive mind. And to those who interpret the cards on intuition alone, it may indeed be a mental straitjacket. But there is hope, because the English language has a lot of words to use. Which means that even though we have a system that demands accuracy, we still have a million ways to accurately describe any one number's abstract essence. Words are important. Pictures, symbols, and icons are also important and can do a lot, but in many instances, they remain extremely subjective and in many cases extremely esoteric, and lack clear equivalents to point to as a translation. The symbols that are pretty common don't need much verbal support to understand. The symbols that are more esoteric to a particular culture usually do require some verbal support, in order to convey to an initiate exactly what each symbol stands for. Because so many established word-based languages have dictionaries, translating from word to word is often easier than translating from culture-specific esoteric symbol to another culture-specific esoteric symbol. That is why this study of tarot strives to perfect a system of analysis that includes a device devoted to the detailed organization of words. I have very definite intent in the meanings of each card or number of this system. These meanings are not born out of occult mystical rhetoric from the past, or even my own personal emotions derived from interactions with the images of existing tarot decks. They are born out of meticulous observations of fundamental, elemental, primordial, archetypal patterns in nature. Thus, Unequivocal word-based communication is of extreme importance to understanding this system. Unfortunately, a problem was encountered when I attempted to define the many ways in which this system differentiates various word associations and the ideas they represent. Describing the difference between words of the major icons as antonymous was easy. But beyond that, I could not find any established terminology that could adequately describe the other subtle, yet distinct variations of meaning that I use elsewhere within this system. As a result, I have been forced to invent my own terminology, which I offer here. Some of these terms are specific to describing parts of my system and may not be so relevant to common everyday semantics. But others might actually be usable by linguistic experts seeking precision in speech and definition of word meanings. Ultimately, like a tarot deck itself, these grammatical terms are intended to be used as a tool for organizing ideas, whether expressed with pictures or words, or pictures and words, with clear reference or unclear reference. These grammatical terms are meant to be used as a tool for differentiation. The discriminating eye, studying the tarot, will understand the importance of these terms. The highly personal, intuitive or interpretive eye, using the tarot, may have no need for them. Personally, I like to utilize both methods. So, I find this particular method of organization useful during the times that I am employing my discriminating eye. Here's the way I approach the semantics of tarot interpretation. First, invent the terminology that will allow for clear communication, whether that be between myself and another person, or my conscious mind and my unconscious mind. In the matrix organization of ideas being presented throughout this study of tarot, meaning is facilitated by differentiation. In such a world, no word or idea can be offered into this system as an objective suggestion of meaning, without also offering reasons for differentiating one interpretation from another. By comparing and contrasting, meaning of words are better understood. In this way, ambiguity in the communication of an idea from one brain to another is reduced. However, as implied above, many recoil at the very idea of reducing ambiguity and establishing precision, or objective meaning. They prefer the multivalent, ambiguous meaning of symbolism over that of any objective meaning. At the same time, people continually ask, what does this card mean? Sometimes, those devoted to personal interpretation of meaning while using a tarot deck will only offer multivalent, ambiguous answers. Others, however, in their study of intended meanings crafted by an author, will attempt a measure of clarity in the communication of that intended meaning. This is where the grammatical terminology being invented in this study of tarot can come in handy. The first term, antonym, is easy. It asks you to define the diametrical opposite of the word or idea chosen. In the parallel nines approach being used by this system of tarot analysis, this differentiation defines the difference between the first half of the major icons, 1 to 9, versus the last 9, 10 to 18. And, as minor suits are seen as children to the parent majors, it also defines the difference between the suits of coins and cups versus staves and swords, with coins and staves being antonymous to each other, and cups and swords also being antonymous to each other. A good example of this in traditional tarot is the relationship between the Lover's card and the Devil card when a traditional deck is arranged in the 2 rows of 9 configuration that this study uses. In the minors, a stark example might be between the love and happiness of the 3 of Cups versus the hate and sadness in the 3 of Swords. An antonym is like connecting 2 points on a globe from front to back, or day to night, with diametrical extremes of difference between the two. The next term, coronym, is a little tricky. It asks you to consider the analogous correlation between an abstract, intangible, qualitative concept and an equivalent tangible, literal or otherwise quantitative embodiment of the same core concept. In the arrangement of minor suits being offered in this study of tarot, there is a correlative relationship between the suits of coins and cups. The same kind of correlative relationship is also seen between their opposite suits, staves and swords. This is how we include ideas that are more action-oriented as well as ideas that are more emotionally oriented. One is the correlative of the other. The feelings and emotions of multiplication, heart, cups are concurrent with the correlative actions and thoughts of addition, diamond, coins. A coronym is like the difference between an actual globe that exists in some kind of tangible reality, versus the intangible idea of a globe that exists in a mind, between the actual and the virtual. It describes the difference between imagination conceptualized and imagination realized. The next term, transonym, asks us to define the complementary difference between words devoted to describing the equidistant similarities of numbers along a number line, as they represent the entering or exiting of our theoretical model of existence. A relationship that is determined by the influence of progress along a number line. As dynamic temporal progressions of ideas are described with a number line, equidistant numbers reveal similarities with a cause and effect or before and after difference between them. One number becomes an agent, the other becomes a result. We've encountered an example of this already, where we see the magician and hermit as representing the intellect, where the magician is young and clever and the hermit is old and wise. A transonym is like connecting 2 points on a globe from north to south. That is, from an equidistantly similar climate in the northern hemisphere, to equidistantly similar climate in the southern hemisphere. Like cold to cold, or cool to cool, or warm to warm, or hot to hot. The next term, invenim, asks us to consider the proportional inverse of a word, or the idea it points to. In the study of existence being offered here, a number line represents the parts of any manifest entity. In representing the many facets of an entity, this term asks us to consider the difference in perspective between the inside looking out versus the outside looking in, and how they become the inverse of each other, creating the kind of inverse symmetry that we see in a point becoming a sphere, which is then considered to also be a point. In psychology, this relationship is identical to the relationship between extroverts and introverts, or people who are included or excluded. In a traditional deck, we can see this relationship between the highly social characters of the lovers, existing at the core of our theoretical model, i.e. a 6, versus the remote character of the hermit, representing the periphery of our theoretical model, i.e. a 9. An invenim is like the difference between the insides and outsides of a globe. Like the fiery core, the earthen surface, the watery atmosphere and the airy sphere of influence. The next term, proxonym, relates to sequential numbers, or ideas, that are adjacent to each other on the number line. The proximate relationship of words is determined by the mapping and segmenting of intangible concepts into a number line form. So a proxonym represents the subtle variations that can be seen as a single core concept is divided into 9 adjacent variations on a theme. To understand the difference in meaning at this level, you would need to have a working knowledge of the abstract concepts that make up the model of ideas, upon which the number line is based. Much more than I can offer here right now. In traditional tarot, some people attempt to describe a progression of thought across the number lines of the minor suits, but with varying degrees of success. Because of the inconsistencies discussed earlier, traditional decks don't progress very smoothly. But in the numerical tarot, they do. A proxonym is like traversing a globe incrementally from north to south, one latitude at a time. Like from cold to cool to warm to hot to warm to cool to cold. The last term, veronym, is also a bit tricky. It asks you to consider a single core concept or idea, and express it in its most extreme or moderate terms. Usually, an extreme variation of a core concept will be taken as too much or too little. Being too much or too little carries with it an implication of subjective good versus subjective bad. While such concepts as good and bad remain eternally subjective, this term invites you to map one's individual, personal subjective sense of good and bad. Veronyms would be utilized when determining the nature of upright versus reversed cards of the same number, in opposing suits. You can't do this with a traditional deck, because there is no consistency in the design of traditional decks. In the numerical tarot, there is. A veronym is like traversing a globe incrementally from front to back, one longitude at a time. Like from day to afternoon to evening to night to dawn to morning to day. That's the invented terminology, with a diagram that hopefully explains how each term relates to the matrix of numbers that makes up the design of all the tarot decks being presented in this study. I use this matrix to sort out the influence of patterns and archetypal influence within a tarot deck, but the same matrix could be used by anyone else for any kind of verbal sorting of meaning. In fact, it would be way cool if a mainstream dictionary were to use these terms in their definitions. These are the levels of abstraction that I contemplate with each and every tarot card or number of numerology. This is how this study attempts to clothe the archetypal roots of various numbers, relative to the fundamental patterns of nature they represent. To acquire this knowledge, a serious study of the theoretical model of existence being presented is required. We need to study the fundamental, elemental, abstract patterns that are used to determine the nature of the fundamental, elemental abstract concepts behind the symbols and icons of each tarot card. Once the conceptual roots of the abstracted primordial patterns have been studied and understood, the subjective vocabulary chosen during the use of a tarot deck may be different for each individual. Thus, we can argue about whether this or that particular word best describes this or that particular number. But the theory being presented here proposes that if we do disagree, it's up to each of us to suggest a better word that does fit, and to do so by also providing the supportive evidence of additional antonyms, coronyms, transonyms, invonyms, proxonyms, and veronyms. In other words, we are not to examine any one card by itself, independent of all other cards. We are always and only to examine individual cards relative to other cards that relate to them in these various grammatical ways. Because, no matter what, the objective pattern of a matrix of subdivided opposites is there, whether we are able to come up with subjective vocabulary capable of describing it or not. The cubby holes are all there. The fundamental, elemental, abstract patterns that lead to the cubby holes are all there. Thus, the challenge being put to each individual studying this system is to sort and organize their own subjective vocabulary accordingly, using this binary matrix of grammatical relationships, and by doing so, reduce ambiguity in their communication of ideas from one brain to another. In other words, with this system each individual is asked to lay their cards on the table. All of them. Arrange them in such a way that if they want someone to believe, objectively, that such and such a card means such and such, they are able to explain. Where in the deck will we find that card's antonym? Where will we find its veronym? Where will we find its coronym? If those questions cannot be answered, great suspicions may arise as to how well thought out each suggested meaning really is, or how extensive and complete the deck being used may or may not be in its attempt to describe as full and complete a spectrum of human experience as possible. Not every tarot deck is so meticulously organized as the ones in this study, using this grid matrix of overlapping binary subdivisions and invented grammatical relationships. In fact, my guess is that to anyone viewing the minor suits as groupings of 10, especially if they see them as representations of the 10 Sephiroth of the Kabbalah, the very idea of a transonym would be lost. And if they don't view the number line as incremental steps of dynamic, temporal, progressive events, then the very idea of a proxonym would be lost too. And if they arrange their suits according to the traditional approach seen in most books on tarot, the very idea of a coronym will be lost. And if they are someone who doesn't utilize reversed meanings, then the very idea of a veronym will be lost as well. This system can help in finding all those associations with ease. Once this system is studied, the archetypal meaning of any card in the deck will be obvious. Anyone using this system will then be able to objectively deduce the archetypal essence of any card, and translate that to a subjective personal meaning, based on an intimate knowledge of fundamental, elemental, abstract, archetypal patterns in nature, and the logical grid matrix organization of subjective vocabulary. I think the invented grammatical terminology being presented here could be very useful. With this system, the endless debates about semantics are not ended, but hopefully improved. Like playing football on a grid, in a stadium, instead of an open field with no such lines of distinction. People using tarot for their own personal exploration of their self that is never made public may not need or want such lines of distinction. People studying tarot, and wanting to communicate what they think this or that tarot card objectively means within a socially constructed reality of knowledge, relative to fundamental, abstract, archetypal patterns of nature and a theoretical model of existence, might find these lines of distinction useful in transferring a thought from one mind to another. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Hope it made sense. Links to eBooks, decks and merchandise below. And if anyone is interested in drawing a deck based on this system of organization, don't hesitate to contact me for a collaboration.